from the Center for Islamic Studies, and I'd like to welcome you here this evening to the second of our series of lectures on understanding the Arab Spring. The first lecture was on October 11th, that was on Yemen. Today's lecture is on Syria. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Hansen Chair for Peace Studies for their support.
Okay.
Our guest this evening is Professor Fred Lawson. Professor Fred Lawson is Lynn T. White, Junior Professor of Government at Mills College, where he teaches international relations and Middle East politics. Fred Lawson is president of the Syrian Studies Association. He's president, but not
Not what you think.
So he's president of the Syrian Studies Association, and I wanted to just mention one of his books to you. His edited collection on contemporary Syrian politics, which is called Demystifying Syria, from Safi Press in 2009. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lawson.
Thanks. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Recent events in Syria show us that large-scale popular mobilization by itself is not sufficient to overturn authoritarian regimes that are well entrenched and well established. This may seem like a very obvious statement to make, that popular movements, popular protests by themselves are not enough to overturn long-time minority authoritarian regimes. But in the heady days of February 2011, even careful commentators on Arab affairs expected that if crowds of young people gathered together and if crowds of young people mobilized one another using social media, long-time dictators could be tossed out, and that it would only take large-scale popular protest in order to change regimes all across the Arab world. For long-time observers of Syria, what has taken place inside Syria since last February is particularly puzzling. We're having a hard time coming to terms with what's going on inside the country. Many students of Syrian politics have argued that the country's new president, Bashar al-Assad, basically favors fundamental reforms, that he is someone who would like to change the country. He is someone who is familiar with politics outside Syria and might be willing to change important institutions inside Syria, but that the president has been blocked from carrying out reforms. And that even though the president himself might like to change things around, nevertheless, there's a cluster of hardliners, a cluster of people who want to keep the system the way it is, and this cluster of hardliners is firmly established inside the Ba'ath Party, inside the country's main political institution, and also well established and entrenched inside the security services. And so the president has been blocked from carrying out the kinds of changes inside the country that he might otherwise carry out. No doubt the most remarkable aspect of the current situation for many of us who are longtime observers of the country is the new president's insistence that popular discontent and popular protest has been toxic to the nation. He's on a number of occasions referred to the protesters as germs, thereby reflecting his own medical training, thereby reflecting the idea that somehow there is something physiologically wrong with the country if there are large-scale, sustained protests against the regime. The president has also insisted on a number of occasions that large-scale protest is a result of interference inside Syria on the part of foreign forces. And it's not Syrians themselves who are protesting against the government, but instead it is outsiders who have come in to disrupt the orderly operation of the country. And both of these statements are deeply disappointing for people who expected more of the current president, who thought that perhaps the current president would work to push for changes in the existing structures in the countries. If we step back just a little bit from current events, we can see that there's a substantial variation across the region in the way that countries in the Arab world have experienced what Gregory Gause calls the winter of Arab discontent. The winter of Arab discontent has affected different countries very differently. In Tunisia and in Egypt, a long-time leader, a well-established authoritarian figure, has been removed from office more or less peacefully. So at one end of the scale, one end of the spectrum, we have this generally peaceful transition away from authoritarian rule. In Yemen, as you heard a couple of weeks ago, the president has pledged to step down on a couple of occasions in the face of widespread peaceful protest, but the president of Yemen has not yet stepped down, so he remains in place. In Libya, by contrast, the country's ruler firmly rejected demands for reform and ended up being expelled by force. In Bahrain, the existing leadership of the country has so far managed to survive a large-scale uprising on the part of popular protesters and has so far managed to survive more or less intact. And the regime remains pretty much in Bahrain the way it had been before. And in Syria, the outcome remains very much in doubt. I actually listened with some trepidation to the radio driving across the San Francisco Bay Bridge last night, listening to reports that an Arab League proposal to end the fighting in Syria had just been announced and been agreed to by the Syrian government. And I said to myself, geez, I've never, on the way to the airport, been forced to change what I had to say just before I came down to give a talk. We still are not quite sure how things are going to work out in Syria. But for all of these reasons, I think it's worth reviewing developments that have taken place in Syria during the course of 2011. 2011's been a momentous year in this particular country. It's been a little hard to figure out the patterns, a little hard to get the story straight for what's been taking place in Syria. So I'm going to venture this evening to try to tell you a coherent account of how things have been developing in Syria as I see them. And then I'm also going to try to make at least an attempt to situate the case of Syria inside a broader scholarship. The broader scholarship in comparative politics, on regime change, and what our friends in the comparative politics field are calling civil wars. Under what circumstances civil war, large-scale internal conflict, breaks out in countries. So what has been the story in Syria so far? At the end of January 2011, the Syrian military command sent troops into Kurdish districts around the northern city of Aleppo to prevent the outbreak of anti-regime demonstrations. The city of Aleppo is Syria's large second city in the northern part of the country, and the Syrian armed forces deployed into outlying neighborhoods of Aleppo to prevent the Kurdish population from joining in popular protests. And this move of Syrian troops into the area around Aleppo accompanied reports that Kurds in the city of Raqqa and in the province of Raqqa had gone into the streets to protest after a couple of members of an organization called the Organization of Western Kurdistan had been killed by Kurdish security forces. So the very first inkling that we have of popular protest comes in the north and comes from the Kurdish population of the country. There were small protests in the capital city of Damascus in early February on the part of human rights activists, liberal activists, activists who said the country had been infringing on the terms of its constitution, that the country was not allowing the free expression of opinion and not allowing free popular assembly. So these rights activists carried out scattered demonstrations in early February. On the 1st of March, an individual named Hussam ad-Din Mansour took up a position in the middle of one of the main squares of Damascus and raised a banner that carried the slogan, quote, "We have had enough. Bashar, save us from the gang." A quite remarkable event, a clearly political act in a country where some of these public political acts are rare. And notice what the demand was. The demand was for the president to step in and protect the country, protect the population from the gang of people around the president who were blocking reform, or the gang of people around the president who were corrupt and taking advantage of the country's economy. In mid-March, 24 women gathered in front of the Interior Ministry in central Damascus. And these 24 women that gathered outside the front door of the Interior Ministry demanded that family members who had been imprisoned by the government and who had not been subjected to fair trials should be released immediately. And they brought petitions to the Ministry of the Interior to release their family members from custody. When these 24 women carried out this small, peaceful protest in front of the Interior Ministry, this action sparked a much larger protest in the area of central Damascus called Martyrs Square. And a much larger set of popular disorders erupted around the fringes of these women. More people took to the streets, more people started clashing with the security services, and a kind of small riot erupts in the center of Damascus in the middle weeks of March. After this incident, security forces come out to the streets of Damascus in force. And the security services make sure that nothing like this happens again in Martyrs Square. Nothing like this escalates out of control in the center of the capital. Notice in this the very initial part of protests in Syria, we see a kind of pattern where the regime responds to popular protest with a mixture of sticks and of carrots. On the one hand, it's clear that the security services and the military commanders, especially in the capital, respond to any protests by breaking up the demonstrations by force. And the regime does use coercion to break up some of these early protests. But the government in early March also responds to the popular protests with some concessions, with some carrots as well. On the 7th of March, government officials announced that they were going to provide jobs for 10,000 university graduates in Syria by giving support to private sector companies. Under the Ba'ath, during the socialist years in Syria, all quite different from the United States of America, but over the last few years, the Syrian government has been unable to carry out that promise. But now the Syrian authorities promised that funds would be made available and loans would be given to small private sector companies to allow 10,000 university graduates every year to find some kind of employment. On the 11th of March, even more remarkably, suddenly Facebook became available inside Syria. Facebook had been censored, Facebook had been blocked. Don't ask me what this means, I have no idea what Facebook is or how exactly it works, but access to Facebook had been blocked prior to this time, but in a major concession on the 11th of March, Facebook suddenly became available. President al-Assad also around this time announced that he was going to give amnesty for 1,000 political prisoners, and that 1,000 political prisoners would be immediately released. Notice the regime is making some concessions. The regime is responding, at least in some positive way, to some of the demands that have been made at the very beginning of the protests. But this initial cycle of protest and reaction was eclipsed and is pretty much forgotten today when a much more severe outbreak of unrest erupted in the southern part of the country in the provinces around Daraa, near the border of Jordan, in the third week of March. And much larger scale, much more uncontrolled popular protests erupted in this part of the country as March went along. The disorders around Daraa famously began after a group of school children wrote on one of the buildings in the town a little bit of anti-Ba'athi graffiti. By all accounts, the graffiti that was written on the building said something like, "The people want the regime to fall. The people want the falling of the Bashar al-Assad regime," which is similar to the kinds of slogans that had been made in Cairo, similar to the kinds of slogans that had been raised in Tunisia. But the police cracked down on these poor school kids. The police brought them into the police station, interrogated them, by all accounts threatened them with imprisonment. And when the police responded with such force to these poor school kids in the southern part of the country, the towns and villages around Daraa erupted in anger. And large-scale protests continued, persisted in the southern part of the country day after day. And as the protests continued down in the southern part of the country, riot police gradually started firing into the crowds. And the protests stopped becoming so peaceful. The protests started to be an occasion for the use of violence, the use of force against the protesters. The state-sponsored media at first blamed the unrest down in the south on what the Syrian newspapers called Palestinian radicals. So the very first charge was that all of this order came from some of the Palestinians who were living in a refugee camp down in the south part of the country. But after a couple of days of blaming Palestinians for the unrest, the regime then started to charge that what it called, quote, an armed gang had started the protest, and an armed gang was carrying out the disorders in the south. The implication was that this armed gang had links across the border into Jordan. Perhaps the armed gang was somehow connected with smuggling, somehow connected with illicit trade going across the border, people operating outside the laws of the country. The regime also occasionally charged that the new head of the Muslim Brothers in Syria was taking the Muslim Brothers on a more violent course than the organization had followed for the previous 10 or 15 years. The regime charged that the new head of the Muslim Brothers had announced that the Muslim Brothers might resume militant activity against the regime. And the Muslim Brothers had not carried out militant activity against the regime since 1982. In fact, the Muslim Brothers have turned very much in the direction of liberal constitutionalism, very much in the direction of liberal reform, rather than armed struggle against the regime. But sure enough, there's a new head of the Muslim Brothers in Syria. The new head of the Muslim Brothers had been associated with some of the armed struggle of the 1970s, so the regime charged that the Muslim Brothers were just about to embark on attacks against the regime as well. The disorders in Daraa then gradually escalated, gradually became more and more violent. The regime found itself unable to suppress those disorders the way it had suppressed the popular protests in Damascus. Disorders quickly spread then to Latakia along the coast. And Latakia exploded into protest when opposition activists clashed with pro-government marchers. And counter-marches took place inside the city. Government supporters attacked opposition marchers. There were fistfights and clubbings back and forth between these two groups of popular protesters. There were reports in Latakia that the police were being shot at, and that the police were being shot at by what the government called Sunni elements. Sunni elements, mainstream Muslim political activists, who might well have connections across the border in northern Lebanon. And when it looks clear, and it does look clear to me, that police were being shot at, as well as the police shooting into the crowds, the government moved some of its large military forces into Latakia. And the government cracks down on Latakia by moving army units into the city and by moving units of the Republican Guard into Latakia. As the fighting was flaring up in Latakia, the population of the city of Hama in the north-central part of the country took to the streets as well. And the rebellion spreads next into Hama. By the end of March, violence had also erupted in the rural areas around Damascus. So even though the capital city itself does not exhibit very many popular demonstrations, popular unrest in the countryside outside the city has flared as well. By this time, the government was organizing pro-regime demonstrations to respond to the opposition. And by the end of March, then, the government was organizing very large-scale marches to support the government, very large-scale marches to pledge their continuing loyalty to the regime and their continuing loyalty to President Bashar al-Assad in particular. On the 30th of March, President Bashar al-Assad finally went on television to address the country. And there were lots of people who were wondering why the president had not said anything prior to this time. The unrest had been going on for almost a month. Finally, on the 30th of March, President al-Assad went on television, and in his speech to the country, the president admitted that the country's reform process had basically stalled out. The political reforms had not been made. Popular expectations for change in the country had not been met, and that the country had not carried out the kind of promise that people had, the expectations that people had when President Bashar al-Assad took over as president. But the president blamed, for stalling out the reforms, a number of external events rather than anything inside the country. The president blamed the Palestinian uprising of the year 2000 for preventing reforms from taking place. He blamed the United States invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq for blocking the reform process. And then he especially blamed the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war for putting a roadblock in the process of reform. So he basically charged that regional, international events had prevented the country from going in the direction of opening up the political system. The president went even farther and charged that all of the present unrest was a result of what he called conspiracies, and that there were conspiracies against the nation, conspiracies against Syria from the outside. It wasn't Syrians themselves who were responsible for the unrest, but rather small groups of people who did not have the national interest at heart. On the other hand, immediately after this speech, the government announced that it was going to create a special committee to study lifting the emergency law in the country. The country has been under a state of emergency since 1963. All kinds of political liberties, all kinds of constitutional guarantees have been proscribed since 1963, and the government announced that now it was time to consider lifting the state of emergency law. The government also announced at that time that it was going to set up a special commission to review a census that had been carried out in 1962. Now, we might wonder what in the world is the political importance of a census that had been taken in 1962, but the 1962 census had consistently discriminated against the country's Kurdish population. As many as 200,000 Kurds that had lived in the country all their lives, that had been born and raised in Syria, were not counted as citizens in the 1962 census. And since 1962, hundreds of thousands of Kurds living in the northeast part of the country had been denied the rights of citizens. The president announced that now it's time to reconsider citizenship for the Kurds. As soon as this announcement was made, there were large-scale marches in Kurdish parts of the country, especially in Hasaki and Al-Kamishli, large-scale marches in which the protesters chanted, "We want freedom as well as citizenship." So some Kurds announced that citizenship wasn't enough. Just reversing the 1962 census wasn't enough. From now on, it would be freedom and the constitutional rights guaranteed to Syrian citizens that had to be given to the country. The second week of April saw attacks on army stations and police stations in the coastal town of Banyas. So disorders spread to Banyas in the second week of April. And once again, the authorities link these attacks on the army and attacks on police to a Sunni network located in northern Lebanon, and charge that Sunni Islamist activists are crossing the border into Syria and are based outside the country. The authorities respond to the unrest in Banyas by locking down the city, sending the armed forces around the city, cutting off all contact between the city and the outside world. On April 18th, then, thousands of residents of the city of Homs in the middle part of the country march into the street and occupy one of the main squares of the city. They occupy the main square, the Clock Tower Square, right in the middle part of the city. And the citizens of Homs march out and occupy Clock Tower Square following the death of one of the leaders of a tribal confederation in Homs province, the leader of the Fawara clan, who had died under mysterious circumstances, and at least it's this killing that precipitates or sparks the popular protest inside Homs. Oddly enough, as the disorder spreads in Homs, as the conflict escalates around Homs, the Ministry of the Interior announces that the emergency law has been rescinded and that the country no longer exists under a state of emergency, that whatever constitutional provisions had been present before the state of emergency had now been reinstated. The Interior Ministry also announces at this point that it's abolishing the State Security Court. The State Security Court that had sentenced many political activists to prison, that had broken up organizations on the grounds that they were political organizations. A week after this, the armed forces finally move into Daraa in force. And the Syrian armed forces carries out a massive military operation in the southern part of the country. As soon as the armed forces move into Daraa in force, the armed forces then move in to Banyas in force. And tanks and artillery forces are used against the general population of Banyas. The reports are that as soon as the tanks are finished in Banyas, they will move in the direction of Homs. And there are reports that tanks are already on the road, headed in the direction of this important central Syrian city. And sure enough, the first week of May is perhaps the most horrible of the uprising to that point, because the first week of May sees major fighting around Homs, major armed struggle between armed protesters and the security forces. And there are reports that protesters are being shot by snipers, that protesters are being targeted as they march through the streets, and there are reports that at least some of the protesters are shooting back. Some of the protesters have armed themselves to protect their neighborhoods. The skirmishes then spread into the neighboring province of Idlib. And Idlib province becomes the center of armed rebellion as the month of May goes by. The end of May sees the rise of a movement across the country to honor a 13-year-old boy who had been tortured and killed while he was in custody of the security forces. And this popular protest movement that honors the memory of Hamza Ali al-Khatib drew marchers into the streets to express sympathy for the family of the boy and to say, we are all Hamza Ali al-Khatib, in protesting against the regime. At the beginning of June, the population of Homs goes back into the streets and regains control of Clock Tower Square on the occasion of what the organizers call Children of Freedom Day. So in memory of this 13-year-old boy, the population of Homs goes back into the streets. And the reports are that there are 50,000 people that take part in this mass demonstration in Homs. At about the same time, in the neighboring town of Jisr al-Shughur, which is in the, actually it's a little farther north, which is in the countryside around Idlib, in the area of Jisr al-Shughur, 120 security personnel were ambushed and killed. So once again, armed protesters, armed opposition to the regime, attacked the security service, carried out this military operation against the regime. And when the 120 security personnel were killed in the countryside outside Jisr al-Shughur, the armed forces launched a major assault against that city. Tanks, troops, artillery mobilized against Jisr al-Shughur, and as you may remember from the newspaper, the population of Jisr al-Shughur basically abandons the city and flees across the border into southern Turkey. And there are reports of large-scale refugee camps, large-scale conglomerations of refugees fleeing the fighting. Army units, after they empty Jisr al-Shughur, sweep through a number of other cities in Idlib province, cities like Ma'arid al-Nu'man and Khan Sheikhun. I mention these towns by name because we have in our audience a world-famous expert of the 1920 and 1925 rebellions against the French, and it's exactly this part of the country that was most active against the French in 1920. So we see a pattern, perhaps, a resurgence, perhaps, of rebellion on the part of people in that part of the country. By the middle of June, protests had even broken out in Deir ez-Zor, in the far eastern part of the country. And once again, Syrian troops roll into Deir ez-Zor, Syrian tanks retake the streets of this far eastern city. On the 20th of June, President al-Assad, who had pretty much been hiding after his previous speech to the nation, on the 20th of June, President al-Assad once again takes to the television, and on the 20th of June, President al-Assad once again claims that it's conspiracies that are responsible for the unrest, and this time he adds that it's also vandals who are taking advantage of the situation and vandalizing the country, and again makes reference to the germs who have come into the country from the outside. But during the course of this otherwise quite belligerent speech, the president proposes that there should be a national dialogue to hash out the country's problems, and that some sort of dialogue between opposition and regime is the way to end the unrest facing the country. The president's proposal to launch a national dialogue is immediately rejected by the opposition. Critics organizations immediately claim that this is not a serious proposal, claim that this is only window dressing. And instead, representatives of various opposition organizations meet in southern Turkey, in Antalya, which is right about there, on the map, and hold the first general convention of opposition organizations against the Syrian regime. At the end of July, there are reports that some army units operating out here in Deir ez-Zor have defected from the regime, And we get the very first reports that there might be army officers and army soldiers who refuse to fire on the protesters. And there might be some army officers that are organizing against the regime itself. The reports are that these defecting officers have formed a Free Syrian Army. And there are reports that elements of the Free Syrian Army have linked up with the protesters, and elements of the Free Syrian Army are fighting against the regular army out around Deir ez-Zor. And it looks like the opposition really has some firepower now. The opposition has some trained, well-equipped soldiers on its side. At the end of August, a prominent religious figure in Aleppo suddenly dies, and he suddenly dies while he's being watched by the police. So he dies under quite suspicious circumstances. Dr. Ibrahim Salkhini, who had been a senior religious figure in Aleppo, was reported to have given a defiant sermon during one of the Friday prayer services, and after he gave this defiant sermon, he had been visited by the country's security agents. And in the wake of a visit from Syria's security agents, he not unreasonably had a heart attack. He was then taken to the hospital, put under police watch, and died in the hospital. So even though Aleppo had been very, very quiet, and even though there was no sign of popular unrest in this crucial city in the northern part of the country, when Sheikh Salkhini dies and his funeral service takes place, several hundred young people in the northern city of Aleppo accompany his casket to the cemetery, and they shout the slogan, "Death but not indignity." And "Death but not indignity" was one of the slogans that opposition protesters all across the country had been chanting prior to that time. So it looked like maybe there was some small sign of opposition breaking out in Aleppo as well. In early September, there are authoritative reports that the president was bringing back in a number of senior military commanders who had been forcibly retired at the end of the 1990s. At the end of the 1990s, a number of senior generals in the security services were suddenly thrown out of office. They were suddenly, it was suddenly announced that they had taken retirement. But now, some of these senior generals have been reported as getting their jobs back, being reported as being brought back to command some of the major security services. And the generals that have been brought back were all closely involved in suppressing the Islamist movement of the 1970s. So it looks like the regime is bringing back hardliners, bringing back military officers that had used force to suppress the Muslim Brothers at the end of the 1970s. On the 12th of September, then, the very first of these national dialogues got underway. And I find it hard to find information about these things, but there's a number of national dialogue meetings that has taken place across the country. A number of different cities has had local level national dialogues. There was a national dialogue in Idlib. There's been a national dialogue in Deraa, a national dialogue in Latakia, and so on. And these national dialogues have been occasions when local people have come in and expressed their grievances. And some of the reports say that these popular expressions of grievances have been pretty freewheeling, that people have leveled severe criticisms against the government. It's been a reasonably open session in these national dialogues. At the same time, however, as you may have seen in the paper, at the same time these national dialogues are taking place, the citizens of Homs marched into the public squares and burned Russian flags. Why do you suppose the citizens of Homs burned Russian flags? They burned Russian flags because Russia had consistently blocked the UN Security Council from condemning the Syrian government. And it's clear that the Russian government is trying to give some more time to the regime, some more time for reforms. The protesters claim that Russia is simply propping up the old regime, so the Russian flags were burned. In the middle of September, a number of opposition groups gathered once again in Antalya and have set up a Syrian National Council. So we now have an opposition organization, the Syrian National Council. The Syrian National Council looks like it's going to be made up of 140 members. The numbers are a little unclear. They keep changing from time to time, but it looks like the Syrian National Council will have 140 members. It's going to have a secretariat of perhaps 25 or 30 members. The National Secretariat seems to be made up of 7 different factions. So it's a huge umbrella organization. It's an attempt to include as many opponents of the regime as possible. What's intriguing to me is that at the same time that the National Council was meeting, at the same time that the National Council was announcing its membership and so on, a local group, more shadowy organization inside Syria, calling itself the Union of Coordinating Committees of the Syrian Revolution, announced that the coordinating committees were going to form an armed group to carry out the campaign against the regime through armed struggle. And the local coordinating committees announced they were forming a Salahuddin al-Ayyubi army to fight against the government. This new armed organization, the Salahuddin Army, joins a couple of other armed battalions that are already active in the area around Idlib. So it looks like there are armed militias that are preparing to take up force, armed militias that are preparing to fight against the army using weapons. In mid-October, the army and security forces swept through the region around Idlib. There were mass arrests, there were confiscations of weapons. There was not the kind of battle that we might have expected around Idlib, but there was certainly a large-scale military operation to try to fight against these brigades. Syria's foreign minister told Russian television on the 20th of October that all of the disorders in the country were caused by, you guessed it, Al-Qaeda. And so Walid al-Mu'allim finally tells the country that it's in fact outsiders, in fact Al-Qaeda, that's responsible for all of the problems in the country. But a week after that, units of the Free Syrian Army finally made their presence known. Elements of the Free Syrian Army, the defectors from the country's armed forces, took responsibility for an attack against an army truck that was on the road in this area between Hama and Salamiya, and this attack on an army convoy killed 9 different soldiers. So we now have reports that the Free Syrian Army is operating, is skirmishing against the government, at least in the northwestern part of the country. 50 minutes later, and I've only spelled out the facts of the case. So much for the facts of the case. How can we begin to explain what's going on? The state of the art, I think, the best analysis that we have so far of what's going on in Syria, we can find in a pair of reports that was published in July of 2011 by the International Crisis Group. And those of you who do not read the publications of the International Crisis Group online are missing a crucial set of analyses of world politics. It's something like crisisgroup.org or something like that. International Crisis Group has published 2 separate analyses of what's going on in the country. The International Crisis Group claims that the uprisings around Daraa and in Banyas, 2 of the early and large-scale uprisings against the regime, have been caused by, their words, strong local identity and a history of rebelliousness in the southern part of the country. The International Crisis Group claims that a strong Sunni conservative outlook is responsible for the uprising around Banyas, and the Crisis Group claims that there are, quote, age-old grievances cases of abuse by the security services, growing rebelliousness, and persistent communal fault lines that have fueled sectarianism in the country. So, smart as they are, the International Crisis Group points to some of these long-standing grievances, some of these old chestnuts about Syrian politics, some of the old chestnuts about splits inside the country. This kind of argument cannot really explain why the revolts have broken out at this particular time and in these particular parts of the country. The two reports do go on to list three factors that I think are more promising. The International Crisis Group claims that at least some of the protest in Syria is a result of what the report calls harmful effects of economic liberalization, especially harmful effects on manufacturing. That industries in the country have suffered dramatically from opening up the country to trade. Opening up the country to trade to Europe, but even more importantly, opening up the country to trade from Turkey, and more recently, opening the country to trade from the People's Republic of China. And goods from China, goods from Turkey have been flooding into the Syrian market, have been driving Syrian companies into bankruptcy, have been forcing local textile companies and plastics companies to go out of business. So the level of disruption of the local economy, thanks to liberalization, the crisis group says we might find some of the sources of unrest in the country. Second, the International Crisis Group points out that Syria is suffering from a truly horrendous drought, and that the long-time severe drought in the country has had, its words, a devastating impact on agriculture. And sure enough, the stories of how agricultural areas in the northeast part of the country have been devastated by the drought, and how whole villages and whole towns have had to move out and move to Aleppo and move to Hama and Homs to try to find some food and some kind of employment, are truly horrific stories. So no doubt, part of what's taking place we might trace to problems in the agricultural part of the country. And last, the International Crisis Group points out in a kind of footnote that the disorders in Syria might be traced to what the crisis group calls the role of powerful smuggling networks, especially powerful smuggling networks along the border with Jordan. So perhaps there's more than just age-old grievances, perhaps there's more than just sectarianism, perhaps there are some elements of the country's current political economy that we will want to tie together with this important set of protests. But there's clearly more work to be done. My own thoughts about this run along the following lines. And I'll be brief, partly because, like everyone else, I really haven't figured out what's going on in Syria either. But my own thoughts would have us remember 4 or 5 useful things, 4 or 5 points of departure for those of you who want to write your dissertations about this particular case. First of all, I think we might want to trace some of this unrest and some of these protests to a couple of crucial communities, sectarian communities inside the country that had prior to this time been key constituents of the regime. So 2 parts of the country that had been pillars of the regime before now, but have now found themselves faced with deteriorating circumstances. One of these pillars of the regime is the Alawi community in the northwestern part of the country, the poorer Alawis out in the countryside. It's a cliche of Syrian politics that the Syrian regime is an Alawi regime, blah, blah, blah. We've read this 100 times. But what we really know is that the Alawi members of the regime are largely clustered in Damascus. They have been getting richer and richer over time. They have been isolating themselves from the poorer parts of the Alawi community, and especially under the current president, Bashar al-Assad, many of the links between the Alawis out in the countryside and the Alawi elite in the capital have gradually been fraying. So it would not surprise me at all if much of the unrest in this part of the country could somehow be traced to the deteriorating relationship between rural Alawis and Alawis in the capital. The second pillar of the regime that seems to be crumbling and we need to pay attention to is the country's trade union movement. It's certainly the case that the city of Homs has been a major area of public sector industry. The city of Homs has been a major center of public sector trade unions. And I guess I'm not too surprised that there's such a high level of protest inside Homs as public sector industry has been harmed so badly by imports coming into the country from outside. Public sector wages have not been able to keep up with inflation. Public sector unemployment has been skyrocketing. And in Syria, it's worth exploring whether or not the unrest and popular mobilization in Homs can be linked to these disaffected, growingly impoverished trade unionists in the country. I've already said something about drought. Let me say quickly that another thing we might pay attention to growing out of the literature in political science is that Syria seems to be approaching a kind of threshold above which large-scale internal conflict is more likely to occur. And there are scholars that have carried out important research, statistical research, about the kinds of countries that experience large-scale rebellion. The level of development that countries reach when they experience internal conflict and civil war. And Paul Collier of St. Antony's College, Oxford, has discovered on the basis of a large-scale statistical study that countries with authoritarian regimes begin to experience large-scale popular protest after the country goes over a per capita income of $2,750. Any country that has a per capita income less than $2,750 is unlikely to experience popular protest. The country's too poor. People are scrambling to make a living. There's no mobilization that takes place in truly impoverished countries. And it's only after a certain threshold gets reached that large-scale unrest begins to be possible. Syria, as of 2010, is right about that point. The World Bank figures for Syria show that Syria, right at the moment, has a per capita income of $2,410. That's pretty close. That's probably close enough for Syria to be jumping into the category of countries that might be ripe for large-scale popular unrest. I've spoken a lot, but I have to say one last word, because I'm so pleased to be here at San Diego State University. During the 1960s and 1970s, scholars here at San Diego State University carried out a number of pioneering studies of internal conflict and resolution. And in ancient times, when I was an undergraduate, I would read the statistical studies that were carried out by Ivo Feyerabend and Rosalind Feyerabend here at San Diego State University. And these large-scale quantitative studies of domestic political conflict focused on the period from 1948 to 1965. So the Feyerabends put together a whole data set about protests and popular unrest and regime change. They didn't call it that, that's a current term, but regime change around the world in the 2 decades after the Second World War. And when we go back and read these studies today, there's a couple of things that jumps out at us. First of all, the Feyerabends discover that Syria, even in the 1950s, stood at the high end of a scale of instability. So political instability, popular unrest, popular revolt is a long time trend inside Syrian politics. In the 1950s, Syria stood at the high end of political instability, along with Lebanon, which we often don't think of as unstable today, and Iraq. Oddly enough, in the 1950s and 60s, Tunisia represents an anomalous case. There's a real puzzle about Tunisia because the Feyerabends discovered that in Tunisia there were high levels of what the Feyerabends call social frustration, which is their primary independent variable, but yet Tunisia also had a low degree of political instability. So in fact, Tunisia is a really important case for us to study. Tunisia is an exception. Tunisia runs against the pattern across the region, even back in the 1950s. More important, the Feyerabends here at San Diego State discovered that political instability is most closely associated with moderate levels of political economic development. So the Feyerabends anticipated by 4 decades the work of Paul Collier at St. Antony's, Oxford. The Feyerabends discovered that rich countries are highly stable, and that very poor countries are also highly stable. But it's countries somewhere in the middle, countries that have a little bit of development that go across what Collier would call a threshold, that are much more likely to erupt into large-scale domestic conflict. Last thing, the Feyerabends discovered that large-scale domestic conflict is much more likely to break out if regimes, in their words, fluctuate in using coercion against the opposition. That if regimes consistently use coercion, if regimes always crack down on the opposition, then opponents know what to expect and they largely stay home. But if regimes sometimes crack down and sometimes don't, so the regime doesn't quite know what to expect, the regime thinks maybe it can, the opposition thinks maybe it can march and not get shot at. It's this uncertainty and fluctuation in the use of coercion that is most likely to be associated with high levels of domestic political conflict. These kinds of general arguments give us only a beginning to understanding the process in Syria, but I think they give us the kind of firm foundation that we would need to, as we go forward, studying this case. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We'll make sure to report to Abel Feyerabend.
Wow. Dynamite. I'd like that a lot.
Professor Lawson has agreed to answer questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I will call on you, and Professor Lawson will
do my best.
Answer it if he wants. Yes.
The very last 30 seconds.
There is a huge and blossoming literature in political science about what political scientists call civil wars and the statistical study of civil wars. And I think that a lot of the conceptual ideas that these scholars have presented can help us understand the Syrian case. I don't think the Syrian case is unique. I don't think the Syrian case is exceptional. There's a number of important concepts that we can begin with as we try to study this case. For instance, since you ask, I skipped over it, but there's an important body of literature that's been developed by James Farron and David Layton up at Stanford University to try to study the kind of factors that lead to large-scale domestic unrest, large-scale political disorder inside countries. For instance, Farron and Layton, in their 2003 American Political Science article, point in particular to things like rough terrain that the opposition can operate in, terrain that the central government has a hard time controlling, areas of the country that lie on the fringes of the country, in areas where routine administration is generally hard to carry out. And I don't think Farron and Layton would be surprised that the uprising breaks out in the far south and in the far west, and even a little bit in the far northeast. These are fringes of the country. So far in Syria, the major cities, Damascus and Aleppo, have not been shaken by this kind of popular unrest. For these and other reasons, whatever has happened in Homs, whatever is going on in Homs, seems to me to be a pivotal question to ask about the uprising. Because Homs is not on the periphery of the country. Homs has been generally favored by the regime. The government has put lots of investment into Homs. The regime has built a big university in Homs, one of the best universities in the country. And so Homs, in general, we might have expected to stay loyal to the regime. So whatever it is that's happening in Homs, whatever has put 50,000 people out into the street in Homs, is a crucial question someone needs to explore.
Yes.
Would you have a number, like a ballpark for civilian casualties?
The United Nations, if I remember correctly, the United Nations says that the civilian deaths have surpassed 3,000.
Do you have a number for the casualties of security services?
That's a great question and a crucial question. Yeah, I have seen a number of about 180. My little calculation says at least 180. The reason that's interesting is for Farron and Layton's definition of a civil war, civil wars are present. We can count Syria as a civil war if more than 100 members of the regime get killed. So I guess, by Farron and Layton's definition, Syria is now in a state of civil war.
Have you heard of any of the mutilations and on the people who died in the military?
Can I ask you to?
Yes, yes, I have.
Be your final question.
Yes, I have. And that is a crucial question, right? It's a crucial question because if it is true that security services have been attacked, and if it is true that security personnel have been wildly mistreated, then much more is going on than just peaceful protesters being crushed by the regime. One of the places that we might try to trace some of these trends is with Joshua Landis's important blog, SyriaComment.com. And there's a number of videos and a number of arguments back and forth about attacks back and forth with the security services and protesters in SyriaComment.com.
Can I ask you a question, please?
Go ahead.
I have a viewpoint and I have a question for you. My viewpoint is we hope if you talk more about the sectarian background of the struggle there, because especially you don't mention Iran or Hezbollah, and you know
quite right.
The
on purpose.
Is now under real crisis because of the Iranian atomic project and the problem with Israel. And there is also Saudi Arabia involved coalition against this coalition.
Very interesting. So I think there is pretty good evidence that the Syrian economy has, let me start over. The Syrian economy managed to survive the 2008-2009 global economic crisis largely because Syria is not connected to the global economy. Uh-oh, I better be careful, except the economist in the audience is nodding his head, so I will take that as a good sign. And the Syrian economy didn't get caught up in the global financial crisis, but the Syrian economy has suffered from imports coming in from Turkey, from economic, from goods coming in from China, and so on. The bright spot in the Syrian economy is Syria's political alliance, strategic alliance with Iran. Iran has been investing in Syria. Iran has been making investments in manufacturing. Iran has been providing financial support that the government has used to keep the economy going, to stabilize the country. So the relationship between the Syrian regime and Iran is a crucial thing to remember. Quite right, thank you. And if Iran would ever completely turn its back on Syria, if Iran would ever completely cut its connection with Syria, the regime would be in a much more vulnerable position than it is at the present time. And so far, the Iranians have stood solidly with the Ba'athi regime in Syria, unlike the Turkish government that seems to sort of be pulling away, maybe even joining the criticism, joining the opposition against the current government. Saudi Arabia. Look, Syria's relations with Saudi Arabia, I think, are quite tangled, and I did make a stab at trying to figure them out about a year ago, and got distracted doing other things. On the one hand, it seems to me fairly clear that relations between Damascus and Riyadh are quite chilly at the moment. Syria's relations with Saudi Arabia are not very good. Syria's relations with Saudi Arabia have deteriorated pretty badly over the last 3 or 4 years. On the other hand, there are some signs, it seems to me, that the Saudi government is not particularly interested in having Syria collapse into chaos, and isn't particularly interested in having the regime completely be overturned by force. And so I've seen some little symbols that maybe the Saudis are channeling some kind of backdoor support to Damascus. So the Saudis are playing both sides of this coin, and I think the Saudi relationship with Syria at the moment has become hard to disentangle.
Professor Kuru.
Thanks for the inspiring talk. I have a question/comment about Homs and Hama. Can we talk about the historical dependence? Because in 1980s, the main massacre took place in Hamas and Homs.
Quite right.
And then it's repeated recently. And it is not a simple historical memory that many families have members still in prison, thousands of them. Therefore, it may be more likely for the people of Homs and Hama to protest because their family members are still in jail and some of them were killed in 1980s.
Could absolutely well be. For those of you who didn't hear, it's absolutely true, and I appreciate being reminded that during the Islamist uprising of the late 1970s, the center of this previous large-scale popular uprising in Syria was the city of Aleppo, the city of Hama, and the city of Homs, in addition to Idlib. So this part of the country has stood opposed to the regime before. This part of the country has long-time grievances, has a history of opposition and disorder against the regime, and even more than that, famously in 1981 and 1982, the Islamist movement in Hama, as well as that in Aleppo, took up arms and engaged in armed struggle against the regime. And as Thomas Friedman never stops reminding us, in 1982, the government cracked down on the city of Hama by sending tanks and artillery shells and elite troops to destroy important parts of the central neighborhoods of the city. So yes, fair enough. There's a history of not just protest, but a history of uprising, a history of popular mobilization against the Ba'ath Party regime in both of those cities. And I'm on record arguing that there are political economic dynamics that explain some of that unrest as well, and that there are trends in the local economy, trends in local manufacturing that we can connect up with the disorders in Hama and Homs in the late 1970s. But the way that story is usually told is that the unrest of the 1970s and 80s is a religious movement, that somehow Hama is a conservative town, that somehow Hama is a place where a more strict practice and strict interpretation of Islam takes place, and that that part of the country was particularly irritated by the Ba'ath Party regime because the Ba'ath Party insists that religion is part of the ancient world and that modern people don't organize their politics according to religious principles. So the story we mostly have about the uprising in Hama and Homs is that this part of the country is more firmly committed to Islam than the government has been. I don't think we see much of that at the moment, and you're absolutely right to point out that the legacy of unrest in this part of the country may be people imprisoned, people who had been killed, property that had been destroyed by the government in the 70s. No doubt that brings some people in Homs out into the streets. But it's not quite the kind, and you didn't suggest this, but it's not quite the kind of Islamist uprising that we saw in the late 70s. But you're quite right. This part of the country has been bubbling against the Ba'athi regime since the 1960s.
Professor Campbell, please.
Yeah. What a great question. Off the top of my head, all during the 1970s, President Hafez al-Assad, the current president's father, on various occasions referred to Salahuddin as a kind of Arab nationalist hero, parentheses, even though his background was Kurd, and tried to associate the struggling Syria with Salahuddin, who threw the Crusaders out of Jerusalem, who championed the interests of the Muslims against the Christians, and so on. And I seem to remember that the President Hafez al-Assad, right, had a portrait of Salahuddin in the president's office. So Salahuddin goes kind of back to a nationalist symbol, a symbol that the Ba'ath regime had used for its own purposes previously. So maybe the rebels are kind of turning against, taking a symbol the regime has used and turned it against the regime. Second thing that jumps to mind is maybe this shows some participation on the part of Kurds in the active armed uprising. I mean, the Kurdish population has been less involved in the protests than other parts of the country, but I've got an odd feeling, I can't give you good evidence for this, that the Kurds are less and less willing to stay distant, less and less uninvolved in the fighting. A week ago, 10 days ago, an important Kurdish activist, a liberal constitutional Kurdish activist, was assassinated up in Al-Kamishli. And it could well be that the Kurds are about to join the opposition in force, so maybe this is some symbol that Kurds and Arabs could rally around as well. It's off the top of my head. Interesting question.
Yes, sir.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. That was mentioned before. Thanks. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I do downplay sectarian dynamics inside Syrian politics and sort of do it on purpose because I think this is what every school child knows about Syria. This is what everybody says about Syria, that there are deep sectarian divisions, and this is what drives Syrian politics. So just to be contrary, I try to ignore this and see if we can understand Syrian politics without relying on sectarian dynamics. And I think in some respects we can, because it would certainly be a mistake, I think, to say that the Syrian regime at the moment is an Alawi regime that is being confronted by mainstream Sunni opponents. I mean, my guess is that we've got Alawis on both sides. Can't prove this, but I'm willing to presume that there are some Alawis that are doing protesting and some Sunnis that are supporting the regime. And I doubt that we can divide up along religious lines the clash in Syria between government and the opposition. Just forgotten the second thing that I was going to say. My apologies. Sorry. Perhaps it will come to me. But sectarianism, I think, gets overplayed in our understanding of Syria, and perhaps we should not ignore it entirely. But I think I'm trying to swing the balance and swing the pendulum the other direction. I have not seen slogans, banners, protests about the regime, about the problem with the regime being that it is Alawi. The problem is that it's corrupt. The problem is that it's tyrannical. The problem is that it has stomped all over the 1950 Constitution, and so on. So unlike the 1970s, when some of the manifestos and some of the slogans were to fight against the largely pagan Alawis, I haven't quite seen that, and if I've missed it, you all should please tell me. But we certainly see on the part of the opposition an effort not to complain that the regime is Alawi, not to complain that the problem is that the regime has a sectarian character to it. I think the opposition recognizes that if the opposition keeps having banners and slogans and marches that claim that the regime is Alawi, then Alawis will rally together. And Alawis will somehow come together to support one another, and perhaps the regime will be strengthened by some kind of sectarian conflict in the country. My thoughts.
I was interested in the economic explanation that you provided. You talk about liberalization, the removal of regulations, particularly in the trade. But then you cited the studies of all the new where correlate capita income per capita to insurrectionary activities. Do these studies at all look at income inequity? How is it factor? What is the 1% of Syria? And
Good.
question to you,
Good.
for me to answer, how do these theories explain Occupy Wall Street?
Yeah. Very interesting. Good. Well, in general, I think the Feyerabends tried to use that variable, by the way. The Feyerabends in the late 1960s and early 1970s here at San Diego State. What? Oh, sorry. The Feyerabends here at San Diego State tried to talk about income inequality as a part of the dimension of what they called social frustration, but current literature about revolution and internal war has not paid enough attention, I think, to the distribution of income. It has instead talked about other factors that help oppositions mobilize, that help oppositions actually fight against governments, rather than what the literature calls grievances. Now, at the risk of going into kind of scholar speak, the current literature on civil war does not pay so much attention about the demands that people have, not so much attention about the gripes that people have against the authorities, but instead against the circumstances. Instead, the literature looks at circumstances that allow those grievances to be expressed. I mean, presumably there are always grievances. Presumably there are always complaints that populations have against the government. But under what circumstances do some complaints create movements? Under what circumstances do some complaints challenge the authorities? So I think income distribution, maldistribution, would be part of a complaint rather than part of the circumstance under which people actually mobilize to carry out that complaint, actually create a movement to push for a change, I think. Tell us about Idlib.
You covered Idlib very well, I think. I wanted to ask about the government tactics from the beginning of the uprising, and how credible you think some of the reporting on the security forces has. And it seems that from the beginning of the uprising in Dara, that the Syrian government had a very strong interest and an insistence on defining the opposition as two things, principally armed and Islamic. And so I wonder, I mean, so there, it seems, I wanted to see what you would say about, the government defines itself as a secular government, but in fact it seems to be deeply sectarian in the way it characterizes its opposition in the first place. And in the second place, the description of an armed opposition before an armed opposition seems to have materialized. And so my real question is, my central question, in the first real armed clash in Disco that you mentioned, how credible are these accounts of, or how credible are the accounts of any security forces deaths? And I mean, the numbers are coming from the Syrian government, from the state media, and so I wonder, how you characterize it.
I certainly have no secret information, inside information. I'm trying to make sense of reports on all sides. I'm trying to point out some occasions when the government did use the term Islamist or used some kind of religious designation against the opposition. It's not clear to me that the regime has done that a lot. I'm not sure the regime has consistently or overwhelmingly talked about its opponents as being Islamists. And maybe for good reason. I mean, maybe the government doesn't want to legitimize the opposition by even associating the religion with these opposition groups, with this popular protest. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if the government doesn't want to rekindle any memories of the widespread popular Islamist unrest of the 1970s. But there have been some occasions when the government has used that term, and especially, I think, in connection with northern Lebanon. Now, again, maybe the regime is making this up, maybe it's rhetoric, maybe it's an effort to justify its own actions, but it looks to me like the regime mostly talks about Islamist movements in connection with groups that have filtered across the border from northern Lebanon. So I just point out that since there are active radical Islamist groups in northern Lebanon, maybe this is not the world's most outlandish claim to make. The other claim that the government seems to be making on occasion is that the protesters are in fact Salafi activists. Now, boy, this term drives me a little nuts, because in my day, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, actually later than that, the term Salafi was used to refer to firmly committed believers, firmly committed practicing Muslims who took an orthodox, strict interpretation of the religion, but were apolitical. And in the Syrian context, Salafis were contrasted to the Muslim Brothers. And the Muslim Brothers were the activists, and the Muslim Brothers carried out armed struggle, and the Muslim Brothers were political actors in the country, and Salafis were trying to present themselves as being just believers, just study groups, just groups that were trying to work out the best way to live, not groups trying to change the government. So in the Syrian context, to talk about Salafis as active, violent Islamist militants seems to me quite wrong. But we're seeing this term crop up over and over. Did my predecessor who talked about Yemen mention Salafis in the context of Yemen? Interesting.
Maybe she specifically.
Very interesting. See, I would have said in Yemen the term might make sense. Very interesting. So you see, none of us has any good sense, any good understanding of how to use this term correctly. The term is being used in Egypt. So what we see in Egypt at the moment is that the far radical, violent, anti-regime Islamist militants are being referred to as Salafis. And there's this pocket of Salafis that's apparently set up camp in the Sinai Peninsula. You all been paying attention to this? And so these Salafi radicals are setting up little communities out in the Sinai, and the Egyptian government is sending troops into the Sinai to try to reintegrate these communities into Egypt before some kind of conflict with Israel flares up. Because the Israelis are really worried by these Islamist radicals setting up camp right next to the Israeli border. So in the case of Egypt, the term Salafi is being used for very militant radical Islamists, and at least on a couple of occasions, the Syrian government has called the protesters, and especially the opposition that takes up arms, especially the opposition that's part of these militias that seem to be organizing, has referred to them as Salafis. So I can't really make sense of this term. Our colleague Gregory Gause at University of Vermont proposes the following definition for Salafi groups in the region. He proposes that the definition ought to be something like very radical, willing to take arms against the government Islamist movements that have some connection to Saudi Arabia. Because what's different about the current groups from groups 20 years ago is that it looks like maybe there's some funding, maybe there's some inspiration back and forth between these militant groups, for instance in the Egyptian case, and the Saudis, who are really quite irritated that the Egyptian people would rise up and overthrow their leader.